Hello, everyone. Hi, hello, everyone. Please be seated and please, please, please come to the front. It's very sad to find these empty chairs here at the front where you are all seated there. So please come to the front. Those that are sitting now, please sit here. There's lots of space here. Okay. Huh? Okay, we are just waiting for people to be seated. Thank you. Okay. 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 Okay, so hello, hi everyone, welcome to FLAD. My name is Rita Faden, I'm FLAD's president, and it's a really pleasure to have you here all tonight. We are continuing this democracy cycle that we have called Democracy the Way Ahead. We started in January 2023 with John Eikenberry, and I'm very happy that we are now in 2024 continuing it with Kori Schake. I would also like to welcome particularly Randy Levine and Jeff Levine, the US ambassador to Portugal, a great friend, and it's always very much welcome here at FLAD. And I'm very grateful for the level of friendship and good cooperation that we have. And for FLAD, of course, the cooperation with the United States is, of course, fundamental. And I think we are able to work together in a fantastic way. So, I would like to present briefly Kori Schake. She is the Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Kori Schake is the author of several books, such as America versus the West, Can the Liberal Order Be Preserved? And Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony. She has a vast experience in government, namely in the US State Department, the US Department of Defense, and the National Security Council. And we will have Lívia Franco from the Institute for Political Studies at Universidade, Católica, that will guide us on this conversation on the role of the United States in the world. It's almost difficult to find the right adjective for this difficult moment that we live with the war in Ukraine, with the war in Gaza, with with all that, and also when we are in a year where we will have the U.S. presidential elections, and all that comes. All the consequences that stem from that. So I think it's a great conversation here that we will have, and I pass the floor to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, so let's start. Good afternoon. It's great to be here with a packed room in this really freezing day, at least in Portugal, the coldest day in the year in Portugal. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Rita, for your remarks and for this exciting invitation to participate in FLAD's conferences series, Democracy, the Way Ahead. My name is Lívia Franco, and I have the pleasure to be moderating today's talk with Dr. Kori Schake. As Rita already mentioned, our guest speaker is currently Senior Fellow and Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Anyhow, to that I would like to add that Kori's analysis come not only from her reputable experience as a researcher and professor, but also from the fact that she has had a distinguished career in government, working at the US State Department, the US Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. Dr. Schake is the author of 5 books, Rita already mentioned 2 of them, and has been widely published in policy journals and the more general press. Actually, those who follow the debates on international politics and US foreign policy more closely will have noticed that the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs features a quite persuasive article by you, by Dr. Kori Schake, titled "The Case for Conservative Internationalism," which is indeed a must-read article. The title of her talk today is "The U.S. in the World, Wars, Policy and Order." And the topics that Dr. Schake more specifically would like to discuss with us are what the wars in Ukraine and Gaza mean for the West, and what we, Western countries, should be doing as policy that we aren't. These are, of course, some of the most pressing challenges on the international agenda, which, to complicate matters further, are occurring in a context of systemic transition of power, of great volatility, and in a year in which elections are being held in several major world powers, most notably the United States. With Joe Biden and Donald Trump as the more than likely presidential candidates, the United States and the world are bracing for a tenser and more conflictual electoral campaign than 4 years ago, and in which Democrats and Republicans present increasingly polarized positions. Dr. Schake is going to talk with us, to discuss with us all these issues. But to analyze this fundamental question, we know it's a daunting task, a task that requires a lot of insight and breadth. And that's why we have the privilege of having with us today Dr. Kori Schake. Dear Kori, I'm very happy it's you that's going to talk about these issues, and I pass the baton on to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for spending this time. So thank you, everybody, for spending this time on this subject. So maybe I'll start with order, then say a couple of things about the U.S., and then talk about the wars. So to start with the order, you know, the anomaly of the post-1945 international order is hard to overstate historically. And there are a couple of things that are specific about it that merit a little bit of reflection. The first is that no dominant power has ever voluntarily restrained its own power in the way that the United States did after 1945. And the US did it for a completely self-interested reason, which is we wanted to build an order where we alone didn't have to preserve it. And the great good fortune that my country has is an alliance structure of friendly countries that share that burden. And the magic of the post-45 international order that Portugal, the United States, and other countries put into effect is that small and medium-sized powers have more influence over outcomes in this system than in any alternative system historically, or that is potentially on the horizon. That makes it incredibly cost-effective for the United States because so many other countries voluntarily uphold the order that is in our interests as well as in their interests. The second thing it does is it allows small and medium-sized countries the ability to affect the rules as well as enforce them. My favorite example of it, anybody know how many soldiers there are in Luxembourg's military? 1,700. A lieutenant colonel who commands the Luxembourg army gets as many votes at NATO as the United States does. And they don't always cast their ballot in a difficult way, but allies do it often enough that it forces the United States into a role of problem solving, bargaining, bartering to get consensus. And that process by itself makes the policies more enduring. You know, it is a common misconception that free societies can't sustain themselves, can't sustain cooperation in difficulty. And actually, the political science research on this shows the exact reverse. That in free societies, because you have to win the domestic political argument to participate, free societies are more durable in policy sustainment and more durable in allied cooperation than authoritarian societies, which can turn at the whim of a single leader. That's the nature of the post-war system, and it's not perfect. The United States doesn't always abide by the rules. But it abides by them often enough that the major supporters of the international order are actually America's allies, right? Because they can see, if you look, if you had been asked to bet money in the year of our Lord 2017, when Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and saying things like are recently reported in the press, about telling Ursula von der Leyen that the U.S. wouldn't honor its NATO commitments. If you'd been asked whether America's alliance relationships would be strong and vibrant at the end of a Trump administration, how many people would have said, yes, they will be strong? Show of hands. I don't see a single hand in the audience. And that is because America's allies worked very hard to buffer us in a difficult time and to ensure that they could buy time for Americans to make different choices. That, I think, should tell you everything about what alternatives to the current international order are. And what are the characteristics of the order that the US and its allies made? First, a fundamental belief that free societies are more peaceful in the international order than authoritarian societies. Second, that people have rights and they loan them to governments in limited ways. Third, that borders should only change by consensus, not by force. And what we see emerging is a Russia that doesn't believe that, a China that doesn't believe that, and North Korea and Iran that are willing to abet those two stronger powers, and the free societies holding hands and standing shoulder to shoulder to try and prevent a change to an order that has made them mostly safe and mostly prosperous. So that's the nature of the challenge. There are two great international relations theory questions. You're a professor of international relations theory, so trample in anytime you'd like. Two great questions we are now looking at in the international order. And one is, it has been an article of faith since Hegel was writing philosophy that for a state to be sustainably prosperous, it had to be politically liberal, right? That the ability to consensually tax your population requires political liberalism, and a tax structure and free economy is what produces prosperity. For the last 40 years, the Communist Party of China has been demonstrating an alternative to that system, and the question is whether it is sustainable. We'll get to that later. The second great international challenge that we are looking at is whether free societies will actually take action before a catastrophe, or whether it takes a catastrophe striking them in order to elicit common action. If you haven't read the economist Adam Tooze's wonderful book about World War I, The Deluge, I commend it to your reading list. And he makes a very persuasive case that the instability of the 1920s and 1930s was the result of the fact that the United States emerges from World War I as the only country strong enough to systemically shape the order, and we declined to do so until after World War II. And I think we are in another of those moments where countries that live in security and prosperity have a fundamental choice to make about whether we are going to be selfish enough to let others experience predatory damage and wait until it comes to us, or whether we are going to sustain an international order that has actually benefited us enormously. So that's the nature of the challenge, I think, to the international order. My sweet provincial country is, as you said, subject of some anxious hand-wringing by our friends at the moment, and justifiably so. I would say, though, that, I'm sorry, Rita, we already had this conversation, but the best description of Americans I have ever seen comes from a British historian in 1923, Bertha Ann Reuter, and she writes, "Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace anywhere else." And that feels true. I'm a historian of the 19th century, and if you think the Trump administration was something, read up on Andrew Johnson, where he's threatening to disband Congress. Congress is threatening to arrest the president before impeachment. And I raise that example because, we have a strong tendency to mythologize post-war America as a place where, we didn't have grubby domestic politicians. We were statesmen, and we thought about the world. And I look for that period of time, and I just can't find it. Let me give you an example. 1954, right? Dwight Eisenhower. There's never been an American president as Europeanist as Dwight Eisenhower. And yet, let me take 1956. 1956, Dwight Eisenhower and his Secretary of State have a very serious conversation. I'm sorry, I'm back again. It's 1954. About whether NATO is collapsing because France won't agree to the return of sovereignty to Germany and vetoes Germany's accession into the European Economic Community. In 1954, when Dwight Eisenhower is president, the 101st Airborne was forcibly protecting black children so that they could go to school in public schools in the United States. Joseph McCarthy was still rampaging around. So Americans aren't newly problematic allies. We have always been problematic allies. And every American president since Harry Truman has thought Europeans don't do enough for their own defense and rely too much on us and are exasperated at that. None of these things are news, but they are problems that we always have to manage as we rumble along and try and work collaboratively. The 2024 election is going to be a messy one, even by American standards. The Constitution of the United States only requires that you be an American, natural-born American and over the age of 35 to run for president. Our political parties very often have people parachute in from the outside. Just remind you that in 2016, both parties nearly had candidates who were not members of the party, right? Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump eventually becomes a Republican. The system is designed by people who distrust government. Powers distributed, authorities distributed, checks and balances. It's built by people who think they'll be fine if the government does nothing. And in order to get the American government to do anything, you have to win the political argument. And nobody's won the political argument in the US. Two things Americans agree on right now. One is that they don't like either candidate for president. And the second is they're really worried about China. Those are basically the two things Americans agree on right now. So you can actually expect that those will be the major issues in the campaign. except for the fact that Donald Trump and Joe Biden actually have remarkably similar attitudes about policy towards China. So it's going to be pretty hard. Both of them are trade protectionists. Both of them are worried about Chinese companies being invested in and investing in the United States. Both of them mysteriously believe that they can have good relationships with Xi Jinping. And so you can expect this to be a really nasty American election to the extent that foreign policy affects presidential elections in the United States. I know there are a lot of people here who know a lot about American politics, so if you have a different view, I'd love to hear it. And everybody would benefit from hearing it. Foreign policy doesn't affect American politics much. I think it has the potential to affect this election in two ways. One is that most Americans have the luxury of not thinking too much about the rest of the world, right? Because we won the geopolitical lottery. We have two oceans, Canada and Mexico, as our neighbors. It just doesn't get any better than that. So we don't have to worry as much as everybody else has to worry. But Americans who don't spend their time thinking about the world have the sense that the world's becoming scarier and more dangerous. And that will naturally affect how they think about the person who's in charge of American foreign policy. But it's not clear to me how that will break, because the erratic nature of a potential Trump presidency is likely to scare people more than the rest of the world scares people. So it's not clear how that cuts. The second is that the war in Gaza, I think, has the potential to diminish support among Democrats for our president. I think President Biden made two assumptions about the war in Gaza that have turned out not to be accurate. And the first, I think, was that that by giving his wholehearted support and empathy to Israelis after the horrific terrorist attack on October 7th, that would give America influence over Israel's choices in how they responded to that. And I think it was unlikely to, and American influence has been minimal over Israel's choices. And the second assumption I think the president made in his policy that hasn't held true is I think he overestimated the extent to which members of his own party, especially members under the age of 60, shared his judgment on Palestinian issues. And that could affect who turns out to vote. I was giving a talk about the wars in my hometown of Sonoma, California over the holidays, and the first question I got asked by a high school student was that they didn't think they could vote for President Biden, although they were themselves a Democrat, because of his policy about the war in Israel. And to which my answer was, young man, if you think the American election for president in 2024 is about Palestine policy, you are not worried enough about constitutional democracy in the United States. Because that's what the election is about, in my judgment, as a Republican and a taxpayer in 2024. So that takes us to the wars. I'm sorry, one more thing I should say about American domestic politics. It's always loud and disputatious, that's who we are. But one of the things that I think supporters of my sweet provincial country might want to reflect on is just how easy it is, how many fire breaks there are built into the system for any individual, even the President of the United States, to take independent action. In President Trump's term, Republicans in Congress denied the president of their own party money to withdraw troops from Korea, Japan, or Europe. The Congress, on a bipartisan basis, just passed a surely unconstitutional piece of legislation instructing that the President of the United States could not withdraw from treaties that the Senate has consented to ratification of. And I think the great success story of 2017 to 2021 was the way the American judicial system really did make and enforce law and as constitution. So I don't think we should despair even in the disastrous consequence of a president of my own party being elected in 2024. Okay, it takes us to the wars. The war in Ukraine. Probably President Biden's best moment in foreign policy has been his stalwart support for assisting the brave people of Ukraine in fighting for their freedom. And it's a great example of international order, actually, because if Donald Trump had been president, Ukraine would already have lost. Because Joe Biden was president and performed the role that American presidents traditionally have since 1945 of defending human dignity, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place, President Biden stepped forward to make a principled case about why it's in all of our interests to defend Ukraine from Russia's invasion. And the Secretary of Defense every single month shows up in Ramstein Air Base at Germany to hear from Ukrainians what they need, to figure out who of the 54 or more countries assisting Ukraine has what Ukraine needs, and figure out how to get it to them. It's a great reminder of what free countries can do when they decide it's in their interest to take common action, and to share the risk and to share the burden of that common action. So 3 cheers for that. 2 problems with the president's policy, however. First, the restriction on the use of weapons provided by the United States, that they cannot be used against Russian territory, provides a sanctuary from which Russia is destroying Ukraine. And the administration, I think, was quite right at the start of the conflict to worry about escalation, because it wasn't clear. We hadn't had this experience before. The president's right to be principally worried about the safety of Americans. But what we have seen over the course of the last 2 years is that actually the United States and its allies, and even its adversaries, China was consequential in pushing Russia back from making nuclear weapons threats. That actually escalation isn't as fragile as the president judged, and we should be providing Ukraine the support to win the war, not just the support not to lose it. The second, I think, error in the president's policy is not dumping a ton of money into ginning up the industrial base, the defense industrial base of both the United States and our allies. We should be allowing several-year contract. I mean, if the United States had to fight a war at the intensity Ukraine is fighting the war, we would be out of precision munitions in under a month. Britain would be out of it in 5 days. Ukraine is currently playing the role for the free world that Britain played in the late 1930s, when the United States wasn't yet at war and Britain hadn't yet been invaded, which is demonstrating the inadequacy of our own preparations to defend ourselves. We have the time to fix this problem. It's an eminently fixable problem. I sailed on the pirate ship McCain in 2008. I was on John's national security team in the presidential election of 2008. And John was fond of saying, if money can solve a problem, let money solve the problem. And money can solve the problem of preparations for giving Ukraine the weapons it needs, for restoring the stockpiles in the NATO allies' weapons cabinet, and we just need to do it, and we better do it before anybody tries to challenge us. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? Russia invaded Ukraine because it wanted to reestablish the Soviet Union. I honestly think it's as simple as that. And, I'm second to only a few in taking cheap shots at the Biden White House, but it's not clear to me any choice by any American president would have prevented Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think you can see a pattern in Russian behavior, and the pattern's pretty clear and pretty consistent of what they're trying to do. And we should take them seriously because we have allies that were former Soviet states, and we are committed to their protection, in addition to the fact that they're eminently deserving of our protection, as Ukraine is. So the prospects for the war. Russia has basically made its economy a wartime economy. That is what they are doing. So 3 cheers for Europe, weaning itself off of Russian energy in a remarkably short period of time. Also 3 cheers for Europe for being the major donor to Ukraine. The United States is the major weapons donor because we're a major weapons producer. And our weapons are interoperable with our allies. That makes it an easier lift because lots of allies have them in the stockpiles, so we can all draw our own stockpiles down to help Ukraine. Europe is the major donor to Ukraine. European countries have taken in Ukrainian refugees, and not just taken them in, put them to work, sent them to school, housed them in homes. It's an incredible act of generosity and solidarity. Second, the European Union has given the majority of financial assistance to keep the Ukrainian government afloat and to set Ukrainian reconstruction in. This is a wonderful contribution, and we Americans should stop being snide about that. When the Ukrainian counteroffensive didn't succeed in breaking through the Russian lines, which the timeline on which we gave Ukraine weaponry allowed Russia time to build defense in depth in the territory it's holding. I think what we are likely to see is slow, grinding breakthroughs of the Russian lines by Ukraine. But the Russian economy is on a wartime footing. North Korea and Iran are now providing weapons to Russia, and China, if they weren't so afraid of Western sanctions, so thank you, Western solidarity, China would already be providing weapons to Russia as well. Those 4 countries are increasingly converging into an authoritarian line of common activity, and they're doing it because they want to change the rules of the international order away from rules that are mutually beneficial and toward rules that are preferentially beneficial towards China and Russia as big states in particular. I nonetheless think there is no negotiation that produces a stable equilibrium. I don't think any Ukrainian government could consent to leaving Ukrainians under Russian occupation, given the war crimes Russia has perpetrated against Ukrainians and in Ukrainian territory. And I don't think the Russians want a negotiation. I think they would take negotiation as a sign that we were losing our willingness to support Ukraine. It's fashionable to say that military force can't solve problems. Only military force is going to solve this particular problem, my friends. Somebody's got to win and somebody's got to lose. Otherwise, it's going to continue. And on the war in Gaza, the Hamas terrorist attack against Israel on October 7th killed the equivalent of 5,000 Americans. And Israel's war in Gaza to try and destroy Hamas has killed the equivalent of 5 million Americans. Urban warfare is incredibly difficult. Nobody does it well. it's incredibly difficult to do it in a way that minimizes civilian casualties when your opponent is using civilian casualties as shields. And professional armies, armies that have years and years of training and discipline, as the United States demonstrated both in Afghanistan and in Iraq, struggle to limit civilian casualties. Israel has a small professional army and a large reservist army. There are not reasons to think they will be particularly good at this. And I think what we are seeing, however, is what a region of the world looks like when the United States attempts to step away from involvement in it. And this is not simply a criticism of the Biden administration. The last 3 American presidents have wanted to reduce our involvement in the Middle East, and they wanted to do it for the very good reason that this is the long shadow of the mistakes of the invasion and management of the Iraq War. So it's a hard case to make to Americans that we should care, because most Americans, my parents included, feel like we over-invested in an outcome that wasn't worth it in Iraq, and they want to ignore the problem for a while. But the big winner of the Gaza attack and Israel's response to it is Iran, which is, Iranian strategy, which is to arm, fund, and support terrorist organizations like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi. They're the big victors in all of this. Israel is isolated internationally. The United States looks like it will move troops around, but not really have the political will to engage in solving these problems. The Houthi are driving 95% of global shipping around the Horn of Africa instead of through the Red Sea. And parenthetically, 95% of the GDP of Egypt comes from the Suez Canal at the moment. Not at the moment, but before this. So there are going to be second and third order effects if we allow this to continue. And so what I think we need to see, the Secretary of State's doing a wonderful job traveling all over, trying to find a key to turn in the lock, and that's good American diplomacy. And as with most American diplomacy, whether or not it works, it really matters to try and to be seen to try, because the international order that the United States and its friends and allies built actually relies on people giving the United States the benefit of the doubt. And here we come to China policy. I promise only 2 minutes and then I'll stop.
Yes, of course.
China policy, which is that I love that my country was wrong about China, that we genuinely believed that a good outcome for us could be a good outcome for China. The responsible stakeholder framework, that we want a strong, prosperous, powerful China as long as it plays by the rules that everybody else plays by. And that's the right American approach to the world. That's an internationalism that dramatically reduces the cost to the United States of keeping ourselves safe and prosperous. It's now clear that's not the China Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party want. And because we were wrong about China, it makes it much easier and cost-effective to bring together the economy of scale of countries voluntarily cooperating to face down a danger. That's what needs to be done in policing China back into rules-abiding behavior, and that's actually the outcome we should all want. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, thank you so much, Kori, for this wonderful, very well organized and really insightful remarks. It's obvious that we have a lot of food to discuss, a lot of thought to discuss. We're going to open now the debate to the floor. All of you that want to make questions, please raise your hand. I will ask you to briefly present yourselves and also ask your questions in a very succinct way so that many of us can ask questions to Kori. Madam Ambassador, please. For the microphone, please. Yes.
Thanks. I'm Randy Levine. I'm the U.S. Ambassador to Portugal. Thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your point of view. Having now serving as an ambassador in Europe, I'm wondering, what do you think will resonate with folks back in America for the election to make them understand the importance of how foreign policy has and will affect their everyday life?
It's a great question, Ambassador. And first of all, thank you for your service to our country. I appreciate your diplomacy. A couple of things. First of all, the world feels dangerous to Americans right now. And so the fact that our friends are helping us achieve what we're trying to achieve in the world, Americans get that and need to be reminded of it because the message really resonates. I talked to my dad's Rotary Club and to school boards all across the country. And my team at AEI just did an incredibly mean-spirited piece of research where we mapped every congressional district in the United States that benefits from aid to Ukraine. Because, of course, 85% of the weapons of the defense assistance we are giving Ukraine is actually spent in the United States. It's buying those American weapons we're giving to Ukraine. Good union jobs, as the president likes to say. So we mapped every congressional district, and then Mark Thiessen wrote a page-long essay in the Washington Post calling out members of Congress whose districts benefit but who voted against aid to Ukraine, including Senator Hawley of Missouri, Senator Vance of Ohio, and Representative Jordan of Ohio, who are our top 3 Republicans to kick. So reminding Americans that it's a misconception that we are the biggest donor of assistance to Ukraine. That matters a lot. People are worried about China and feeling like China doesn't play by the rules. Europeans reminding that you and we are the people who set the rules, enforce the rules, and play by the rules ourselves. And my colleague Fred Kagan likes to say, nobody wants to die for the liberal international order. And it's true, but people get it when you say, what we are trying to do is have a level playing field. Our allies and we have a level playing field. China's trying to get a different set of rules. People get that.
Please.
Thank you so much. Julia de Klerk with the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
Yay.
And the Marshall Plan, of course, being one of the paragon projects of what you just talked about so eloquently, Kori. The self-interest US investment in the post-war order and in allies. I'm also very graciously hosted at FLAD at the moment. Thank you, Rita. Thanks to all the wonderful colleagues for allowing me to do some research here. Kori, I wanted to tie in actually with the ambassador's question. You've talked so eloquently about US location, geography, and how that explains the US mentality being sort of an island unto itself and having this very privileged geographical location, and yet also made a case for why the United States should be and keep investing in the world, and talked about these 2 wars. I wanted to talk and hear you talk a little bit more about what if the world, so the US should stay invested in the world, but what about the world coming back into the US and into domestic politics, whether people worry about it or not? You talked about Russia and also the war in the Middle East, a new war there. What about, how worried are you about election interference? Of course, a lot of people say that the Russian president has maybe an interest in having one presidential candidate over another. And the other one would be terrorism. You talked about 9/11, but of course, how worried should Americans be that also escalating, an escalating conflict in the Middle East?
I'm actually not even kidding when I say the biggest threat to Americans is Americans. that Abraham Lincoln's beautiful. The only way democracy in America can be destroyed is by Americans, and that's genuinely true, right? So I did a little looking into election interference in the 2020 election and the 2016 election, and there was election interference in the 2016 election. Fortunately, the American electoral system is so distributed and controlled locally by states, it's actually really hard to get traction on voter rolls, on all of those things. So the big sloppy mess of provincial America is our great safety. But also we've gotten a lot better at understanding the vulnerabilities of the electoral system. And if you look at, for example, the reason that cyber hasn't been a major factor so far in the Ukraine war, right? We all thought this was the new domain of warfare. We were going to see flying sharks with lasers. And none of that happened in part because NSA, the National Security Agency, has gotten really good at understanding how networks get penetrated and cooperating with America's friends and allies to make all of our systems more resilient. In the US, the challenge is actually connecting businesses which have understandable incentives not to acknowledge when they have been penetrated, to share information so that people know what's happening. On election interference, if what you mean is disinformation, the Russians and Chinese are going to have to work to get up to the American domestic standard on this. And there's actually no defense other than voters. At the end of the day, that's where all power resides in the American political system. And we exercise that recklessly from time to time, but I'm not actually worried about the Chinese government being so smart about how to persuade a free society to do what's not in its interest as I am about my mom voting for Trump for a third time.
Thank you. More questions. I also would like to encourage college students here in the room to ask questions.
Come
I don't know
on,
if
you
want
people who are going to shape and inherit this world. Let's hear from
Sorry.
you.
Any college students? Okay,
Yeah.
yes, please.
Well, I just finished my master's, Tiago Coelho, postgrad at King's College London.
Outstanding.
And thank you. Thank you, madam, for coming here today. I just had a question, actually, a bit adjacent on what you've been talking regarding IMF and the reform that IMF hasn't yet set forward. The Asian Bank that China has placed hasn't yet been also outputting some, good projects that are outflowing their, what is theorized sometimes, debt traps. But in some questions, you could say that in the long term, IMF might be drowning in its own, consequence that it might have in the future. What is your take on that?
Yeah.
Thank you, Tiago.
Thanks. That's a good question. So China is now the world's largest creditor because of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I am extremely sympathetic to the countries that have accepted BRI projects because most of them don't have better alternatives. So the short answer is, those of us who don't want countries getting stuck in debt traps ought to offer better alternatives. Because, as we were talking before, I used to work for Colin Powell when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he was fond of saying, you never beat a bad idea with no idea. And us saying, don't do this, to countries that are struggling to create economic opportunity for their people, I just don't think that's a defensible position, especially not from wealthy, highly developed countries. That said, there's a reason that the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, wouldn't, or the German government or the American government, wouldn't make those loans, because we never thought they were going to be in the black. And so I think we're actually going to have two big problems as the result of large-scale Chinese investment internationally. One is a lot of countries are going to default on those debts and are likely to come to us and ask for protection from China taking the infrastructure. Those are going to be hard calls. The second challenge we are going to have is that China is trying to change the rules of how debtors get repaid. And a lot of the BRI contracts have clauses requiring that China be repaid before anybody else. And as we saw in Zambia's default, that's not going to be acceptable to the United States, the European Union countries, Britain, and other major international lenders. So we got to figure both what we want to do about both of those things, because I think as we saw COVID dramatically reducing support for purchases of raw materials, which is how a lot of the countries that are BRI recipients make the majority of their GDP. We got to help them accelerate past that into more services and more domestically sustainable production.
Please, yes, here in the front row. Yes, please.
Patrick Ziegler-Later, President of the American Club of Lisbon. You talked a little bit about isolationism, which has existed in America since the founding of the United States. How in the 20s and 30s it was in a way harmful to the world that America was isolationist. It is a growing trend. It appears to be a growing trend in the US and certainly in one of the two parties. What is your forecast for the growth of isolationism?
Can I just say something? You have to read Kori's article on foreign affairs because it's precisely a reply to that, but please.
So I went through the polling data on exactly that issue. And you are, of course, quite right that Americans have always been reluctant internationalists, right? We want to be left alone to watch the Kardashians and play video games. But Americans also don't like the world they see when we are isolationist. And you can see that actually in support for assistance to Ukraine. You can see that in anxieties Americans have both about the terrorist attack on Israel and about the human cost of Israel's retaliation in Gaza. So we are reluctant internationalists, but we are internationalists. And the thing that propels Americans into caring about the world is actually the values that we share in the transatlantic community. So values are how you pull Americans out into the world. And weirdly enough, even the majority of self-proclaimed Trump voters do not consider themselves isolationists. So I'm actually pretty positive that Americans will continue to be persuaded when we bother to try and persuade them that they should care about the rest of the world. And that's my experience at Rotary clubs and synagogues and church basement turkey dinners.
Okay, so yes, please, in the middle of the room, yes.
Thank you. Kori, it was very interesting. Thank you for being with us. I am Fernando. I am a university professor and I entertain myself in a platform we call pompously Club of Lisbon. But anyway, I am in front of me a report, very recent report of the Eurasia Group that is led by Ian Bremmer and Cliff Caption about the top risks in 2024. And they say that 2024 will be politically the Voldemort of the years, the annus horribilis, the year that must not be named. And they say that 3 wars will dominate world affairs. Russia versus Ukraine, now in its 3rd year. Israel versus Hamas, now its third month, and the United States versus itself, ready to kick off at any moment. And their argument is very compelling because what they say is, whatever the result, the US presidential election will worsen the country's political division, testing American democracy in a degree the nation has not experienced since the Civil War, and undermining US credibility on the global stage. As an European, I was a little worried with this. Can you please calm me?
Well, I would point out that what the Eurasia Group is good at is looking outside the United States. They're not particularly expert at looking within it. I do think the presidential election is hugely consequential. And even though I am confident that the institutions of democracy in America and the vibrancy of American civil society can sustain our democracy, even if we re-elect a dangerous American president, I nonetheless think that the signal it will send to the rest of the world if the United States chooses to re-elect a president who says and does the kinds of things that Donald Trump is saying and is threatening to do, will so change how people think about us and maybe even how we think about ourselves, that it will be incredibly damaging to the United States and to the international order, because it will cause people to question both whether America will help sustain the order and whether they want us to. I actually think the idea that America is teetering on the brink of, irreparable civil harm, I just don't think that's true. Because that's not the goodness that you see all over the place in the United States. That's not the cooperation that you see on school boards in North and South Dakota. It's not the civic pride. If you look at polling of American attitudes about our government, people hate the federal government. They really like their state and local government. And that wouldn't be possible if it were really true that America was, torn irredeemably asunder. It is also true, so I don't know what you teach at university, whether you're a political scientist or something else, but if you're a political scientist, you will know the political science data. Okay, so then you don't know anything. I'm sorry, I'm just playing. Political scientists, the political science data is actually quite strong, that you get maximum friction in a democratic system when it is narrowly divided. And we are a 51-49 country right now, and that few percent of fluidity is actually making for more political extremism. It's weird. As a historian, I would have thought that the party in power would be most aggrandizing when comfortably in power, and it's actually not true. The political science data is actually quite strong on the fact that when narrowly divided is when political parties think they can win the most because by affecting the 2%, so they get more extreme. I think that's what we're experiencing right now. And the example I would give you is aid to Ukraine. The vast majority of Americans of both political parties support continued and even increased aid to Ukraine. What we are seeing in the mess that Congress is making of this is Republicans control one of two legislative houses and don't control the executive branch. They barely control the House of Representatives. And the only lever they have to affect Democratic policy on the size of the federal debt, the size of federal spending, and the border is holding hostage aid for Ukraine and Israel because they know the president needs it and they know the public wants it. So that what we are seeing is political brinksmanship by a small group of Republicans in the House who are able to deliver outsized policy consequences.
Okay. Kori, because we're left
I'm
out
sorry,
only
I'll be
with 20 minutes.
I'll be shorter.
Perhaps we can grab 3 or 4 questions and then you'll answer them and
Sure.
final remarks, okay? So a lady who wants a lady too? Yes, please. Okay, also a college student
Also
from
there.
Brazil, yes? Yes, please. And then I'll give you the floor. Yes.
I'm a college student. I have recently joined Católica to study international relations, and
Yay.
Lívia happens to be one of my professors. And
Lucky you.
That's right. And recently we have studied an article by Kagan called "The Jungle Grows Back," and this conference has reminded me a lot of it.
Yeah.
And you did say that the United States is not exactly isolationist, but according to this author, specifically in the world scenario and upcoming elections, would you say that it is possible that the United States at least takes on a more passive approach when it comes to foreign policy and world affairs, because it might no longer want to be the sheriff of the world?
It's a great question. And I'm not sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, that's okay. Yes, please.
It's a great question, and I'm not sure, to be honest, because what I think we are seeing in the Middle East is what that region looks like when the United States withdraws from trying to help countries make themselves secure and prosperous. And nobody likes what we're looking at in the Middle East right now. And so whether my mom connects those two things is not yet clear. An election is how we are going to know the answer to that. But I can give you a precedent. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs does annual polling of American public attitudes on foreign policy. And in 2016, there was a lot of support for Donald Trump's 3 fundamental beliefs: that trade is bad for the American economy, that immigrants are taking American jobs, and that, I can't remember what his third nonsense was, but right, so he got a lot of votes on the basis of American support for that. When Americans saw the policies associated with that, they actually didn't like it. And so the American political system is tied more tightly to public attitudes than most other political systems, both with a first-past-the-post voting and elections every 2 years. And so I do think it is quite possible that as the world feels more dangerous, that's going to make Americans realize the jungle grows back if you don't weed your garden, as George Shultz used to say. And that a message that I and my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute keep pressing in public with legislators is that it is so much cheaper to sustain a beneficial order than to recreate it if you let the jungle grow back. And so that's I think that's a winning proposition with the American public.
Thank you. So 3 more questions here, please. And then the lady over there. Okay, and another student, and then we will end.
Can we get the young man in the green T-shirt?
Okay, yes, I'm sorry. But please, first here in the first row, and then, okay.
Jeffrey Levine, the spouse of the U.S. Ambassador. How are you? Thank you for coming. It's my recollection that the Soviet Union failed under the weight of the arms race with the United States, perceived to be a victory of capitalism over communism. It's my impression now that China, if you read the economic news, is also failing under the weight of its communism coupled with its demographics of one-child policy. How do you see that playing out in the near future?
Okay, Kori,
Great
can we, yes, the gentle, with the green T-shirt, the student, yes, with the green T-shirt, please.
Now can I take your pad? to record the questions?
Yes, of course.
So, my name is Baltazar. I study political science and international relations in Nova, in Lisbon. I'm from the concurrence. But my question is, how do you look to what is happening in the American universities right now? Do you think it is a reflex of the international context, or do you think it's more of an internal concern?
Good question.
Thank you.
The lady in red, yes, please. And another one, and it's... Okay, so let's do it, yes.
Thank you. My name is Dolores Baldassar, and I relocated from New York, as the accent will suggest,
Dead giveaway.
here to Lisbon. And thank you so very much. This is my first FLAD event, and if this is what I can expect, I will attend more.
Yay.
You've been really interesting and enlightening. I do have, but
Always a but.
you know, I'm a little, well, you will see. I love that you, well, so much that you said resonated with me, but when we talk often about, you said something about our polling systems or voting and the infrastructure. And I have a problem with a lot in our voting process because of, number one, the Electoral College. Number two, there's been incredible voter suppression. The reduction is unbelievable. Voter rolls have been purged in many states to the degree of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people. And also these new voter suppression tactics. So I don't know if you can comment a little on that and calm me, because as the other man said. Another thing is it's nice to hear the United States being referred to as sweet, but with 800 military bases around the world and wars all over the world, far more than just in Ukraine and in Israel. I find that contradictory, and I also have to say that we often talk about the casualties in Israel, and and it's not just been since October 7th that people like me have been thinking about the situation. The plight in Gaza has been outrageous for over 70 years. I'm sure you know this better than I, because you know a lot of things better than I. But I think these things need to just be said because it's atrocity. And people are often being very one-sided about this, and I think we should be more transparent.
Okay. Thank you so much. I think it's enough, right? You already have 3-4 questions, very diverse.
Okay.
Okay.
So first on China. You're absolutely right that American policy, you can feel the gears meshing, right? That for American policy to address a stampedingly successful China. But that is actually not the China we are any longer looking at. Every major Wall Street firm now believes that the Chinese economy will probably never overtake the American economy. Partly, they will grow old before they will grow rich. I mean, per capita GDP in China is what, $18,000? That's roughly equivalent to Mexico. That's not gonna, it's not clear that GDP is actually the right measure of state power. And the Chinese government can't get its foot out of the wolf trap for reasons about ideology and domestic political control. And so they're stuck. That may not make them less trouble for us. It may make them more trouble for us. But we need to adjust our policies to policies that penalize China for breaking the rules, but give them a clear path to success. But you're exactly right. The Chinese Communist Party's theory of victory and continuing domestic control has been economic prosperity in return for reduced political liberty. And they now can't deliver on the economic piece of it. what that means for China, I think, is an open question. And my team at AEI has 3 warring tribes of views on whether it's more, less, or irrelevant to the threat of China. On universities, I am so grateful that there was no social media when I was a reckless college student, because I actually think college students and young people in general ought to be granted the privacy to be dumb and wrong, as I was dumb and wrong when I was a young person. I do think that there's a lot of anti-Semitism being allowed to rage on American campuses right now. But they are not, American Jews are not the only people who feel scared right now. And I actually think everybody would be better off if we paid less attention to the foolishness on college campuses and told those kids to go get a job. On the Electoral College, you know, there's a reason we have the Electoral College, because it's the only way to get consensus between large and small states about how to elect a president. So, yeah, it's unfair. Do you think direct democracy would be any less dangerous? I'm not sure, to be honest. I also don't see how you get North Dakota to agree that my great golden state of California ought always to be determinative. So there are a lot of unpleasant balances in how you structure a democracy, and the Electoral College is one of them, but I don't see how to improve upon it, and I don't see, even if you could improve upon it, how you would get the states that currently balance the weight of New York and California in the system to be able to agree to it. So it's imperfect, as most things are in free societies. On voter suppression, it's ensuring people have the ability to cast their ballot and that their ballot gets counted is fundamental in democracies. And I am, in general, supportive of voter identification. But here's the problem. If you don't have a bank account or a driver's license, and you can't get valid identification, that prevents you from voting, even if you're an American citizen and have registered to vote, if voter ID comes in. I don't know what the answer is, what the policy should be. I know what the answer is, which is every American should have the ability to vote, because that's how it should work. On your 800 military bases, I would remind you, my friend, that they are all there with the consent of the territory whose government they are in. That's the difference, right? The American military doesn't, in the year of our Lord 2023, it's not any place where a government doesn't want us. And the reason they want us is because they feel safer with American troops on their territory. And so I don't actually think American military power projected over the world causes more wars than it prevents. Okay, my friends,
Okay.
thank you for this
Thank
time.
you so much.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you also. Thank you very much, Kori.
Thank you for your good leadership.
To the audience for your wonderful and very diverse questions. It was a pleasure. Thank you, and thank you to Floods. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much. My God.
Thank you for your good leadership.